Welcome to the Fifth Element Lens. I'm Dean Hager. Today we're doing something a little different, talking about a topic that's very close to my heart. And today we're talking about environmental justice and how it should shape the way that we build businesses. This episode gives you a viewpoint from my lens and a few others. So let's now take a moment to do our somatic check-in. Now, I would highly recommend, if you like somatics, that you seek out a somatic therapist. I love to do this just because people check out from their bodies, and especially when we've been burnt out or working too hard, or we're working on our business or trying to get it started, we just check out. So this is our way of checking back in. So if you can, sit or stand so you feel steady. Breathe in for 4 counts. Hold for 2. And then breathe out for 6. Now notice one place in your body, your feet on the floor, your shoulders, your breath. And I want you to name that sensation quietly. Keep that feeling with you as you listen. Now, this episode is all about systems, something I love to examine thoroughly. I find it fascinating. But systems are made of people, and grounding helps you stay connected to both yourself as a person and the people around you. So when I say I learned this work of environmental justice from the ground up, I mean it literally. I had already experienced an environmental injustice as a worker by the time I went back to earn my university degree. I was already an adult, and I decided to become a research assistant for the environmental justice professor at the University of Washington. So for her, I did some field work, some data collection, and some transcribing of community interviews. And at her behest, I spent some time in neighborhoods where pollution and poor health outcomes were a part of daily life. And I learned how to trace impacts back through supply chains, our policy choices, and how to see a single product or project and how it ripples across the systems of, people's bodies or jobs or neighborhoods. Part of that training was learning how the debate itself gets shaped, and I saw how big organizations with deep pockets can move into conversations about environmental justice and try to steer them into their direction. You'd think that environmental justice will be pure at first glance. No, it's been infiltrated, and I want to explain that for you. So one example I studied closely was the Heartland Institute, which is a group that has shown up in public debates that questions mainstream climate science and reframes environmental issues in ways that protect certain interests of their own, certain industries. And in practice, that can kind of look like funding research that emphasizes uncertainty or promoting talking points that shift blame, and maybe even amplifying stories that make clean energy look risky or dangerous. And I remember one time in class, we were presented a film, and the professor just went out of the classroom. I didn't quite understand what was going on there. But that happened a lot when I was in school. We'd just be dropped off with a film. And that film pushed the narrative that wind farms cause cancer. And at the end of the film, I noted who had funded that film. That was the Heartland Institute. And the film presented a scary, very simple narrative that you put turbines near people and health problems will follow. And that message will land with a lot of people because it was emotional and immediate. And, there are people that are sitting there in their kitchen and a windmill or a turbine has been put near their home, and those blades are flipping past their window, causing a blinking light. So it makes the light go on and off, on and off, on and off, constantly as that turbine shadow crosses over their home and their property. And there is something to be said, that there is some validity to that. Could drive you crazy. There's some validity to that. But does it cause cancer? That's my question. And it doesn't. It doesn't cause cancer. It can cause a heck of a headache, though. I give them that. And that's why that message will land with some audiences. I have some compassion inside, and I was immediately concerned for the safety of those people. But that claim doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. Public health research and a lot of reviews show no credible link between wind turbines and cancer. What the film did do, intentionally or not, was create doubt. And doubt is useful if your goal is to slow a transition away from fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel industry is amazing at stirring doubt. That pattern is important to recognize. Big oil and related interests don't always argue openly for pollution or extraction. That often they reframe the conversation and they point to the limits or the harms of the alternatives. And they amplify isolated anecdotes or push the idea that any change will create new victims of its own. The effect is meant to freeze policy and public will. It's meant to make the status quo look like a safer option. If we understand that tactic, it changes everything about how we can respond. It does not mean ignoring real trade-offs. There are real harms in mining, and siting, and in supply chains, no doubt. But it does not mean that, I guess it does mean that we need to demand the evidence, really. We can't ignore real trade-offs. We need to find out what's real. We need to center the people who actually live with the impacts. And that's not too hard to figure out. You gotta just look at where you're putting your business. What are you doing to the air? And what are you doing to the earth? It's also, refusing to let fear of imperfection of our solutions to justify keeping systems that are clearly harmful. So, in summary, what did I learn at UW? I learned to map the harms of environmental justice, to listen to workers and communities, and it gave birth to the thought of designing choices so that the burden of progress doesn't fall all over the people that may be asked to be the ones that are accepting the externalized harm from the company. But the burden of progress shouldn't fall on marginalized communities. That's just not the way progress should work. So, what environmental justice means for business. Environmental justice is a design lens. It's never supposed to be a checklist or something like that. This is a comprehensive evaluation that needs to be done when we start a business. It asks you to map the full system of your business, where it touches, and to name who pays those costs. And I guarantee you accounting doesn't have that on the balance sheet, but you need to have it on your radar. That includes for land, water, ecosystems, the people who do the work. You got to hold these questions for a minute and like actually exhaustively research them. Who pays for my convenience and profit in health, time, or land? Who carries the risks when things go wrong? Workers or nearby communities or subcontractors? Whose labor and land subsidize my margins? You know, the worker's lens matters. Harm shows up as in workplaces as illness, injury, and unsafe conditions. Shows up in neighborhoods where low wages are making recovery impossible. If your model depends on harming people, your business's resilience is built on a very, very weak foundation. So let's switch gears and talk about these. So for decades, gasoline and diesel engines have really been the driving force for a lot of our progress and our productivity overall. And that growth came with predictable costs that are still concentrated in certain places and people. What I'm trying to say, how is the harm distributed? It's distributed in frontline communities, near highways and ports that face higher levels of particulate matter in the air and nitrogen oxides, which raise rates of asthma and heart disease. It is known, research has proven that if you live next to the street or next to a busy road, you will have higher rates of asthma. It is proven. So, other ways that the costs show are like workers in refineries getting sick, fuel transport, and maintenance people face exposure to toxic chemicals and dangerous conditions. That's why they're getting sick. And of course, we all know, or where we should know by now, that climate impacts from carbon emissions worsen storms, heat, and flooding. And those impacts hit marginalized communities first, mostly because they can't rebound that quickly from them, but also because of where they are located. Infrastructure has locked in funnels of investment into fossil fuel systems, making cleaner alternatives harder to scale. And those are not accidental things. They are the result of design choices. I'm talking about design choices like where roads are made, where refineries are sited to be created, and how the costs are actually priced, and who holds the power to make sure that their system stays in place. The result is a system where neighborhoods and workers carry the costs so that others can move faster and cheaper in their big ol' Escalades. Electric vehicles, though, charge, your car, and you'll be wondering, how much am I actually saving the planet? I know I do. Electric vehicles change where and how harm happens. They reduce some harms, but they create others. So this is where environmental justice gets very complicated, because we know that it's not a straightforward thing. Like I was telling you about those windmills or those wind turbines, they definitely cause some people some great deep headaches. So that is an environmental injustice in itself. That is true. But it's about trade-offs. And understanding those trade-offs is essential. If we look at what EVs reduce, like no tailpipe pollution, that means cleaner air along roads and in dense neighborhoods that immediately lowers harm for frontline communities. It means less direct dependence on fossil fuel infrastructure. And that right there weakens the economic logic that concentrates pollution around refineries and ports. And there's a potential for local energy benefits. EVs can pair with distributed renewables and storage, and create more community value if designed that way. And EVs, though, do introduce some other harms, like mining impacts. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, and other minerals are often extracted in places where indigenous lands, water, or worker safety are at risk. Supply chain labor risks are mining and processing can be very dangerous and poorly paid work with, if it doesn't always have strong standards and enforcement around the mining. And battery waste. If we don't have reuse and recycling systems, batteries become a new kind of waste stream that can harm communities. But you're asking, wow, that's a lot. Wouldn't that hurt everybody? No. EVs still matter for justice because EVs remove the daily visible harms of tailpipe pollution from dense neighborhoods and workplaces. And that immediate reduction in health burden is very meaningful. It also changes the political and economic landscape. Less money and infrastructure are tied to fossil fuels, which makes it easier for the push for just overall cleaner, air, cleaner systems that don't pollute our water and our earth, fairer systems for people. EVs are definitely not the final answer. And I can't say that my EV experience has been so exciting that I'm bubbling about it. It's not easy being an EV owner in the early days. But they are a lever, and it is one that must be paired with other types of things like labor protections, responsible sourcing, and circularity in the systems to make it a more environmentally just solution. So it's not a perfect solution. Sustainability is about trade-offs. That's what they always told me. And as I learned about it, I learned that we still were designing extraction into our systems, even when we were designing them to be sustainable. There is no zero harm option today for transport. Unless you take your bike or you walk. And I think the question here is who decides what system do we get to use and who bears the cost? You can't just say, no, we can't do anything because both options are bad. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Because the current option is just going to get us cooked. What I mean by that is combustion engines are continuing to put carbon in the air and create a situation where we will live in an oven. And if you want to keep contributing to that, then it's not just your children that'll pay the price. It's your grandchildren and everyone after that. You can accept trade-offs that lock harm into certain people and places, or you can design to remove that extraction over time. And there are ways for making trade-offs, principles. I dare say that we have principles. First one is make harms visible. You need to map that pollution, extraction, and labor risks across your entire supply chain. Visibility forces accountability. You want to center those people who bear those costs. Ask those workers in frontline communities what repair looks like and let their priorities guide your decisions. And you want to commit to time-bound reduction. Trade-offs are only temporary. When you set clear roadmaps to phase out the worst practices, we need to design extraction out with EVs and other things, that everything that goes beyond that allows us to have a cleaner environment overall, a safer environment overall. In this example, I would recommend that we require traceability, so we know where the battery minerals come from and who works in those mines, and then put our preference on suppliers with verified labor and environmental standards. That is something that companies could do. They could also build circularity into their systems, design batteries and products for reuse and repair and recycling so materials stay in circulation. And they could do the responsible manufacturing decision, which is to fund take-back and remanufacturing from day one. And finally, of course, they need to raise labor standards, ensure that miners, factory workers, and assembly line workers have living wages, safety protections, and collective bargaining. Let them speak for themselves and what they need. Worker power reduces the incentive for employers to cut corners. And actually, that wasn't the final one. How about another one? I would say we also need to localize the value. So that means creating a win-win. We want to pair EV deployment with local renewable energy and regional manufacturing to keep jobs and benefits close to communities. Investing in repair by directing a portion of the profits or the policy mechanisms to health or remediation or community development in places that are harmed by extraction. And when these pieces all come together, EVs stop being a simple swap of engines, combustion engines, and instead become more of a tool for systemic change. Less air pollution in neighborhoods, fewer workers exposed to toxic fumes, and a shrinking role for fossil fuel. You know, if you are at a business right now or at a company, I invite you to do this, to try this. Try mapping the harms. Where does my product create pollution, extraction, or other worker risk? From raw material all the way to product disposal. Map the whole thing. And ask the questions a worker would ask. Who does the work? And what would it take to make that work safe, fairly paid, and dignified? Once you've figured that out, where you have gaps, where you're hurting people, where you're hurting the environment, set a phase-out plan. What practices will we stop funding in 5 years? And how will we support affected workers and communities during that transition? You want to design for circularity. Think about how materials can be reused, repaired, or recycled so that extraction falls over time. And you want to share your decision-making power. think about which communities that you need to involve and what workers you need to involve to give them a seat at the table for sourcing and siting choices. You want to keep your answers honest and turn this awareness into action. Create that 5-year plan. If this episode landed for you, the Fifth Element Lens is built just for this, to move teams and individuals and teams, from intention to design. I run workshops and provide this framework to help you map out the harms and draft plans that center workers and frontline communities. If you want to experience these tools, I can help you get started. Thanks for listening. I'm Dean Hager. Build with the people who carry the costs in mind. Designed for repair, not for extraction. I'll see you in the next episode.